Hi, boys and girls. I'm in the car waiting for Rusty to be groomed, so I figured it'd be the perfect time to read you our next chapter of the Mystery of Craven Manor. We're on chapter 9, which is called Held Prisoner. And if you remember what we had just read, Sam and Matt are in the attics at Craven Manor. Chapter 9. They crept back to Sam's bedroom and locked themselves in. Just before 7 o'clock, Mr. Higgins came to let them out. "I expect you are both hungry," he smiled. "Well, Samantha's parents have agreed that you shall join us for dinner, although you do not deserve it, Samantha." You think we want to eat with you?" she flared. "I'd rather take my food to the stables and eat with the horses." His smile disappeared. "Perhaps it will come to that if you continue to misbehave." Mr. and Mrs. Cooper, or their substitutes, Matt peered at them closely. No, they had to be the real Coopers. The likeliness was perfect. Were already seated at the table when they went down. Great Aunt Dorothy wasn't there, and Matt wondered when he would meet her. They ate in the dining room, glancing round at the dark paneled oak walls and the dark brocade curtains. Matt thought it hardly more cheerful than the conservatory. The chandelier high above their heads did little to light the gloom. A grandfather clock struck the half hour and everyone jumped. Later, they'd served themselves from a large tureen of mushroom soup. Matt glimpsed Irene through the half-open dining room door. She was carrying a tray upstairs. Why didn't the great aunt eat downstairs with the others? It was a strange household. Everyone was silent, unsmiling. "You're not very talkative, Mommy dear," said Sam. "Poor Matt must be bored with all this silence." Mrs. Cooper put down her fork. "Oh, I'm sorry, Matt. I was thinking about something else. How are your parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jackson?" "But you're old friends, Mommy. Surely you know their first names," Sam said. Mrs. Cooper looked helplessly at Mr. Higgins. "Dennis and Fiona," Sam said. "Dennis and Fiona," Mrs. Cooper repeated. "Yes, of course. I look forward to meeting them again after the holiday." "That proves they're fakes," hissed Sam in Matt's ear. "There's no such people as Dennis and Fiona Jackson." You will not whisper at dinner," said Mrs. Higgins sharply. "It is very ill-mannered." Silence descended again upon the table. Feeling distinctly uncomfortable, Matt took too much soup on his spoon and slurped loudly. He looked up to apologize, in time to see Mr. Higgins making furious faces at Mrs. Cooper. Matt was uneasy. He didn't believe Sam's fantasies, oh no. But all the same, something was wrong. He didn't know what it was, but definitely something was wrong. Everyone was grim, tense. It was as if they were all waiting for an explosion. Perhaps this Higgins man had a hold over the Coopers. Perhaps he was blackmailing them, threatening them. Perhaps that explained the changes Sam saw in them. She couldn't expect people, even her parents, to remain cheerful and normal if they were being threatened. He began to feel indignant. He hadn't asked for this. He had enough problems of his own, and he wished heartedly that he had never met Sam in the woods, that she hadn't persuaded him to come back to the manor with her. Right now, the last thing he needed was to get caught up in someone else's situation, one that might bring the police here. After dinner, they moved to the drawing room, where Mr. Cooper headed straight for the whiskey decanter and poured himself a large measure. Mrs. Cooper took a seat by the empty fireplace and began to flip through a magazine. Mr. Higgins was restless, moving around the room, touching ornaments and books, twitching curtains. No one spoke. Matt could sense Sam's tension as she sprawled beside him on the sofa, pretending to read a book. He could almost feel sparks of electricity shooting from her. Well, he'd had enough. Tomorrow morning he would find an excuse to leave. He had no idea where he would go, but he had to get away from this spooky house and this strange family before Sam involved him even more. Suddenly, she flung her book to the floor. "How can you all go on like this? It's all make-believe. It's all..." She choked. "Well, you needn't think I'm going to be a part of it. You make me sick, all of you. Look at you two, my parents, my father, and my mother pretending that she can read. My father would never do this, and my mother has a degree in anthropology. She doesn't spend her time looking at pictures in trashy magazines and trying to read the headlines. And you," she glared at Mr. Higgins, "you absolute toad, some tutor you are. You don't even know the difference between Dickens and Shakespeare." Mr. Higgins moved towards her, his face thunderous. Matt groaned. She was doing it again, causing trouble. Why couldn't she just shut up? Hastily, he ground the heel of his foot in her instep. "Ow, what'd you do that for?" He glared at her. "Because you're behaving like the worst sort of spoiled rich kid. How can you talk to your parents like that? You don't deserve to have any." Sam's mouth fell open, but he stood up. This isn't turning out to be my idea of a holiday. I thought you were okay at school, but you're just behaving like a brat, and I don't see any point in staying. In fact, I think I'll ring my Uncle Dan in the morning and get him to come collect me." He turned to the Coopers. "I'm sorry. Thanks for offering to look after me, but I think it'd be better if I moved on, if that's all right." The Coopers looked at each other uncertainly. "Well, started Mr. Cooper. "Perhaps we can talk about it at breakfast," said Mr. Higgins smoothly. "In the meantime, I suggest we end the evening now. I will show you to your room, Matt." Sam's face was a picture of betrayal. Matt tried to ignore it as he politely wished the Coopers good night, but he could feel her eyes boring into his back as he followed Mr. Higgins up the stairs. "The stupid fool," he raged to himself. "She was going to spoil everything." Mr. Higgins was as sharp as a razor, and it was obvious that he was the one in charge. If he thought Sam had told Matt her wild stories and that Matt believed her, he could well make things awkward for him in the morning. "I hope you will find this comfortable." Mr. Higgins opened a door at the end of the corridor on the first floor. "You have your own bathroom, so there is no need to lose yourself searching for one amongst all the rooms." Aha, so he did suspect. Matt's heart sank. "I really would like to leave in the morning," he said. "Sam and I haven't got a lot in common. I think I'd prefer to be with my Uncle Dan." "And where does your Uncle Dan live?" In London?" "And where in London?" Matt gave the first place he could think of. "Mayfair." "Ah, a wealthy man, your Uncle Dan." Not really. Actually, he's a chef." Matt wondered if he would ever be able to lie without stammering and blushing. "A chef," he repeated, "in a big hotel." "In the name of the hotel?" Mr. Higgins persisted. "I can't remember. I only know his telephone number." Young man, perhaps I will contact this Uncle Dan for you in the morning. I suggest you take the opportunity for a long sleep tonight, as you may have such a long journey tomorrow, all the way to Mayfair, London." Mr. Higgins smiled mockingly and closed the door. Matt glanced around the room. It was large but simply furnished with a single bed, a desk, a comfortable chair, a dressing table, and an outsized mahogany wardrobe. The window was large, but the casements were fitted with locks, and there was no sign of a key in any of the drawers. He inspected the bathroom. It was well fitted, but there was no window. After a while, he crept over to the bedroom door and tried the handle. Well, at least he wasn't locked in. That was a relief. But he had better not try to reach Sam's room, even if he could remember exactly where it was. He was sure Mr. Higgins would be on the watch for that. But if he could stay awake long enough, there might be enough chance to get away once everyone was asleep. Fully dressed, he lay under the bedcovers and listened for what seemed hours to the faint noises of the house, creaks, footsteps, and murmur of voices. At last, when his watch showed 2 o'clock and the silver of electric light from the landing had gone, he felt confident that everyone was asleep, and slowly, stealthily, he left his bed and made his way across the room. Just as he reached for the door handle, he heard a strange humming sound, and he snatched his hand away. He waited, listening to the sound dwindle away in the distance, and then opened the door. He was just in time to see the tail end of the wheelchair disappearing into a room at the end of the corridor. "Great Aunt Dorothy?" he whispered to himself. He waited another 5 minutes, but there was no other sound in the house. Carrying his shoes, he crept down the great staircase and across to the front door. It was locked. More locks. No escape there. Turning, he crossed to the door leading to the kitchen. The kitchen was empty, but again the outside door was firmly locked. He backed away and looked around the big room. One of the cupboard doors was larger than the other, stretching from ceiling to floor. Opening it, he saw a flight of stone steps leading to the basement. Silently, he crept down the stairs and began to explore. The first door he opened led to a larder, shelf after shelf of tins and packets rising to the high ceiling. Enough for a siege, he thought. Perhaps that was what Mr. Higgins and Irene were expecting. The second room, smaller, was a vegetable store. There were 2 large sacks of potatoes in the corner, and the racks held root vegetables. Strings of onions were suspended from hooks. Along the length of one shelf stood boxes of apples. Matt's stomach reminded him with a gurgling rumble that it was several hours since he had eaten dinner. He stared at the apples. They were those crisp green ones with the flesh of pink. His fingers itched. Crunch. The noise was unnervingly loud, and for an anxious moment, he held the large, juicy bite of apple motionless between his teeth, but no one stirred. The third room was empty, but the fourth fulfilled his hopes. Ropes, tools, even a ladder. And an added bonus, it had a door opening to the garden, and the only locks were bolts on the inside. With a sigh of thankfulness, he stepped into the room. He had read about people's hearts sinking, but he had never believed that could actually happen. Until now, as he felt the sudden grip of a hard, bony fingers on his arm. "Sleepwalking, Matthew?" asked Mr. Higgins softly. Let me escort you back before you wake up. Matt said nothing. That is the end of chapter 9. Comment your thoughts about this chapter. What do you think? Do you think Mr. Higgins is a character that we can trust? And how do you think that he knew that Matt was in the basement snooping around? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Bye, guys.